We're going to begin with the deepening crisis in Afghanistan. The US president is threatening to strike back in response to attacks outside Kabul airport. As many as 60 people, including 13 members of the American military, have been killed. The armed group ISIL has claimed responsibility. Joe Biden says the service members who died are heroes, and he's vowing to make those responsible pay. The president has asked military commanders to draw up plans to strike back. The Taliban has condemned the attacks. The group's spokesman told Al Jazeera the area in which the assault happened is under the responsibility of the foreign forces.
There's this attack, but then there's also the situation around the airport. The gatherings of tens of thousands of people around Kabul airport is a suitable location for these attackers. This is in fact a security mishandling, a big error from their part and a big mistake. We've warned the foreign forces several times of the repercussions of large gathering around the airport.
Hamid Karzai International Airport is where thousands of people have been gathering, desperately hoping to flee Afghanistan. Western countries have been using the airport to evacuate their citizens, their troops and Afghan allies. Charles Stratford begins our coverage.
Ambulances rush through the streets to collect the wounded. Bodies are lifted onto stretchers. The two attacks by suicide bombers happened close to the Abbey Gate entrance of Kabul airport, near the Baron Hotel.
There was a sudden explosion. We climbed out and saw that there were many people affected. People were hurled everywhere. Their brains were scattered. There were also foreign forces who were fallen. I saw at least 400-500 people there. The explosion was really powerful. Half were hurled into the water, others on the ground outside. We carried the wounded here on stretchers, and here, my clothes are completely bloodied.
The Baron Hotel is controlled by the UK and NATO forces. It is one of the places where tens of thousands of Afghans have been gathering after the Taliban took control of Kabul on August the 15th. They've been going there to have their papers processed before being evacuated out of the country. Western governments and security experts in Kabul had been warning about potential attacks around the airport for days. The Taliban told Al Jazeera it had intelligence about potential car bombs in the area and also warned people to stay away. An increasing number of NATO countries have already announced a halt to their evacuation operations. And these attacks jeopardize remaining flights, meaning many Afghans who want to leave their country and may have all the necessary documents to do so could be left behind.
Well, let's speak to Charles Stratford, who's in Kabul for us. Charles, it's only a matter of days before all the foreign troops are out of Afghanistan and security for Afghanistan falls to the responsibility of the Taliban. Are there any indications how the Taliban is planning to beef up security in the country?
Well, the Taliban, as so far, we know that they have been pulling in fighters from the provinces to try and better protect Kabul. They've been doing that for the last few days, but as the attacks yesterday proved, seemingly to little effect. Although the Taliban blame the Americans for causing the hysteria and pushing the amount of people in that direction to try and get out of the airport because of what they're offering, i.e. an evacuation out of the country, it's got to be said that the Taliban are actually supposed to be in control of the area outside the perimeter fence of the airport. And yesterday, as we were beginning to hear these increasing warnings of an imminent attack, the situation in that area was incredibly tense. The Taliban more aggressive, arguably, than we've seen them before, trying to keep people out of that area. They'd put up an additional barrier, a couple of buses across the Abbey Road entrance into the airport. That's the southern gate, and that's where one of these attacks happened. The other one close by at the Baron Hotel. We know, according to the Pentagon, that the Americans and the Taliban have been working together in trying to protect the civilians and the airport from attacks. And it's very interesting that last night We heard fighter jets, or at least one fighter jet above, and it was about 10-15 minutes later, as this jet was still in the area, that there was an almighty explosion, and everybody thought, goodness, you know, it's another horrific attack. It transpires that it wasn't. According to the Taliban, it was the Americans blowing up infrastructure or possibly ammunition, it's difficult to say, before they obviously withdraw. But although we're seeing at this stage, and so the Pentagon say, cooperation between the two sides, that in theory all ends in a couple of days, and it is obviously debatable as to how competent the Taliban are going to be in dealing with this ISIL threat.
That's going to be the key question, isn't it? Because we know that ISIL has at least claimed responsibility for this attack. One would imagine that the Taliban, given the fact that, as you say, in a couple of days' time, they are going to be solely responsible for security in Afghanistan, they're going to have to be rethinking what the perceived threat is from ISIL in Afghanistan.
I think yesterday was a horrific, tragic, rude awakening, just how big a threat ISIL are. Just to put a little bit of context on this, as the Taliban moved towards Kabul over the last few weeks, they have been opening up prisons on their way to the capital to free Taliban fighters. But in and amongst those fighters, staying in the same prisons being held there, were what some report to be possibly thousands of ISIL fighters that have been captured in recent years. They, of course, now are free, and there are more weapons available, arguably, in this country now that the Americans have gone and left so much behind, certainly in some areas, according to our sources. So that, of course, poses a huge threat. And as we're saying, what the Taliban are probably not going to get, or certainly don't have, is the kind of intelligence gathering that the Americans have offered the previous government. Obviously the kind of air power and target, the ability to be able to make precise strikes against ISIL in this country. So arguably the Taliban, their backs are seemingly at this stage against the wall, and it's very difficult at this stage to see, you know, how they can cope. Although one thing most analysts will tell you is that no matter there being questions over their ability to be able to run a country with respect to the country's finances, for example, and this country faces huge, great financial and economic problems, one thing analysts say is, well, the Taliban can deal with security. Well, they're not going to have birds in the sky. They're not going to have fighter jets. And as I say, there are a lot of ISIL, freed ISIL prisoners out there now, according to the people that we've spoken to.
Charles Stratford in Kabul. Charles, thank you. Well, Kimberly Hockett has more from the White House on US President Joe Biden's response to the attacks.
I bear responsibility for fundamentally all that's happened.
Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military, Joe Biden, holding a moment of silence for the Americans killed in Thursday's bombings in Kabul, the deadliest day for the U.S. military in more than a decade. But despite the deaths, Biden says the evacuation and the withdrawal will continue until August 31st.
We will not be deterred by terrorists. We will not let them stop our mission. We will continue the evacuation.
This despite at least 13 U.S. service members killed on Thursday and at least 18 more injured. Dozens of Afghan civilians have also been killed or hurt by the blasts outside the Kabul airport, at its Abbey Gate, and the nearby Baron Hotel. The U.S. is blaming the group ISIL-K, a rival of the Taliban, for the attacks.
We thought this would happen sooner or later. It's tragic that it happened today.
The U.S. says its mission to evacuate all those wishing to leave Afghanistan will not change. The president says the United States will retaliate against those responsible for Thursday's blasts.
We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
But some Republican members of Congress are outraged and are calling for Biden's resignation. They're furious by reports U.S. officials allegedly gave the Taliban the names of Americans and Afghan allies permitted to enter Kabul's airport perimeter. The move was designed to speed up the evacuation, but critics accuse officials of generating a kill list for America's enemies. Former Navy SEAL Republican Congressman Dan Crenshaw wrote on Twitter, "If true, this qualifies as borderline treason. We need to find out who's responsible for giving the Taliban a hit list, and they need to go to prison." Biden's not denying such a list may exist, but also did not confirm. Some Republicans and Democrats argue the Taliban cannot be trusted with America's security. They blame Biden for the crisis, but Biden insists, well, the Taliban is not America's friend.
It's in their self-interest that we leave when we said.
Once U.S. troops have withdrawn, President Biden says that the United States will still have the ability to evacuate anyone left behind. But his orders remain unchanged. The military will depart on August 31st. Kimberly Helkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
PJ Crowley is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs and former U.S. National Security Council spokesman. He says ISIL-K is fighting for resources and territory.
The Islamic State is going to claim this as a great victory. The Taliban is pointing a finger at the United States, saying if the occupation forces were not there, this would not happen. The United States is going to withdraw from Afghanistan in the coming days, and we'll have to find, another way. Maybe in concert with the Taliban, of striking the Islamic State forces who are responsible for this attack and trying over time, to minimize the impact they can have in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the region. I think what they want is power, influence, and money. They're situated close to the Afghan drug trade, and that obviously is very, very profitable in terms of drugs moving outside of Afghanistan, and ideology is a part of this. They have a stricter quota than even Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So on the one hand, they have a mix of motives. On the other hand, they only number a couple of thousand. And as we've seen, across conflict in Afghanistan over the years, there's always been, movement of people, with this allegiance and coalition one time, this allegiance and coalition another time. So I think this will be a major test, for the Taliban. Can they shift gears from running a successful insurgency to running a government and actually controlling territory?